All right, so recording some post read thoughts today on A Clash of Kings by George R. R. Martin, which is the second book in his A Song of Ice and Fire series. This one being a direct sequel to A Game of Thrones, which I read most recently a year ago, so it was really fun to read this one, get back into the series. I'm not really like into the fantasy genre per se, but to me these books read more like historical fiction in like the bulk of the story, and then there's like some elements of fantasy kind of thrown in, so it works really well for me. I'm just blown away. Like there's so many times when I'm reading, this book or Game of Thrones, like I just think it's insane how one person can come up with an entire world just in their imagination, and like there's hundreds of years of history like represented in these characters, like that, the great houses, and so much stuff that's happened in the land where this is set, and it's just like he came up with it all in his mind. It's absolutely amazing. And I love that some of it is like you don't need to know obviously like all of the backstory to appreciate this specific series of books and what happens in these books, but like for example, the characters like the Greyjoys on the Iron Islands, like they're known for being like very determined, very rigid, very strict, and it's like you get that by just seeing how the characters interact with each other. But then when he builds out something like Greyjoy's Rebellion, just in passing, honestly, like it's just like a little bit, like maybe a few paragraphs and a couple of chapters from Theon's perspective that allows like you to build like who the characters are, what the house represents, and like why they are where they are, if that makes sense. So that's just an example, but there's cases of that like all the way through where he uses like prior lore that that he came up with to just build like what's happening in the present in these books. So I think that that's incredibly impressive. Just at a high level, like the story of this book I thought was really good. I'm not sure if I like it better than A Game of Thrones. I think it's at least like on par. I'm still not sure which one I would ultimately prefer, but I'll have to spend more time thinking about that. This one I thought was interesting is like a very slow burn, which I really wasn't expecting and I will have to I'm going to spoil both of the books, and I kind of have to if I'm going to talk about it in earnest, but the end of Game of Thrones, like the war is essentially kicked off. There's a little bit of fighting towards the end, but you now have like multiple, I think there's 5, kings that are claiming, the throne, that they're all now fighting each other. I was expecting it to kind of kick off page 1 with that, like heavy and knee deep into the war, but it's really not. It's still a lot of setup and a lot of intrigue and like scheming on behalf of the houses, and like building up strength in terms of like what they're going to do with how they're going to attack the other houses and stuff like that, who they're going to ally themselves with and how, and that kind of thing. So I wasn't expecting that, but I think it works well. The payoff in the third act of this book is really, really strong. So it's definitely not a critique. It's just something that I was a little just surprised to observe, like a few hundred pages in, really enjoying it. I was just like, really not a ton has happened from a plot perspective. And I think when I read A Game of Thrones, the thing that I came back to the most was, there's these like 3 planes of action happening at once. There's the war for the Iron Throne. There's things that are going on beyond the wall, namely now what we see through Jon Snow's perspective. And then there's Daenerys across the Narrow Sea in a different area, basically trying to like build up strength, trying to get back to the 7 kingdoms. I was amazed with Game of Thrones, and it's no exception here, but basically every chapter is just told from a different character's perspective. And I think in this book, there were only like literally 10 characters, and the chapters just shift. I think that he does such a good job of telling the story, again, just from like rotating who's got the perspective of that particular chapter. And he does a really good job of like time passes in a really cool way. Like if a chapter ends and there's something that's happening or about to happen, when you come back to it, however many, dozens or hundreds of pages later, time typically has passed like in a very effective way, which makes sense. And I feel like that's a really hard thing to do. And I've seen this in other books where it doesn't work particularly effective, or it can really hurt the pacing, or just kind of like the perspective of the different characters doesn't flow together very well. But I think it's absolutely fantastic. And, I have seen a critique of this book that, like, for example, there's only 10 characters really where you follow their perspective. So for one, like Catelyn Stark, you really only see the fighting like of Robb Stark and actually like the Northern Army through Catelyn's perspective. And basically like when she leaves the North and heads south for various reasons in this book, you really never see anything from Robb Stark's perspective. You only hear about it from other characters talking about it after the fact or rumoring about things that have happened. I think it works well because I think that the characters he chooses to focus perspective on, like, you learn about and see the communications between somebody like Catelyn and Robb, but you see it from Catelyn's perspective. So you feel like that mother-son dynamic between them, but you get it from her perspective, which I think really works. So I personally would rather have something like that than feeling like instead of having to do 10 characters, you do 30 or whatever it is from different perspectives. I think that would make things feel way too jumbled. So that is a critique that I've seen. And, it's not just like, that's just one example, but there's several others where you only see Stannis Baratheon's, like conversations and stuff going on with him basically through the chapters featuring Davos. And, the list kind of goes on and on. So again, I think it works well, but I've seen it as a critique. I think out of the three, I really enjoyed the main, scheming and war for the Iron Throne the most. I was much more interested in the Jon Snow chapters featuring like the stuff going on north of the Wall way more than I was in the first book. This time, like, they're actually pretty much the whole time actually like past the Wall. They're not just like at Castle Black at the Wall or whatever. They're on like ranging expeditions past it, which I think it makes it very interesting. It felt very precarious. I liked that quite a bit. And similar to the last book, the Daenerys chapters I was just least interested in, and that's the same now. I was shocked though that there was very little chapters featuring her. I think I did like it a little bit more than the first book, but I still didn't love it. At least this time it's like she's the leader. Everybody knows that. And now she's trying to build up strength and an army to be able to make her way back to exact the revenge that she wants. It's still just like, I guess I'm just way less interested in what's happening in those other places than what's happening in the main Seven Kingdoms with the main royal houses. So we'll see in the future books if that kind of shifts. But I do think it's cool, like a slow build of her, like obviously clearly in a terrible place at the start of the story, and now she's like gradually building up strength. So I think it's like a effective long game. It just like isn't my favorite kind of like in these first two books. And then the plotting around just the quest for the Iron Throne I thought was so good in this book. I really loved the chapters focusing on Robert's brothers, Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon, two brothers claiming to be the Iron Throne. We know from the perspective, like the reader knows that Stannis Baratheon has the rightful claim to the throne. But then I just love, I think the chapter is from Catelyn's perspective when she travels to see Renly and is basically trying to talk them into switching their allegiances against the Lannisters, but they end up fighting each other regardless. Just the back and forth between them just felt such like a brother type conflict where you can tell they care for each other, but it's like they have like this petty pride and stuff, which I think like a lot of sibling relationships that can be a part of. And I just really thought the writing was amazing in that. And I was surprised by what happened to Renly. I was not expecting that. But again, I felt like way less of this book was actual like war fighting than I was expecting. I was expecting that to be almost the whole thing, but it really was not. So like when Renly gets killed, so much of it then becomes like, well, what allegiances are these houses under Renly going to switch to? And we spent more time with that than we did the actual fighting, which I thought was cool. I think some of it too, Martin uses like the hubris and just like folly of people extremely well. Like Stannis, who's claiming to be, the rightful king on the throne, which we know that he should be, but he's absolutely obsessed with overtaking Storm's End because of just like he felt slighted that Renly was gifted that rather than he was, even though I think it was just from the narrator's perspective that Robert didn't mean it as a slight when he gifted Stannis Dragonstone. That was from the Targaryen perspective, like the heir to be, that was considered like their titular land that they held or area that they held. But then he took it as a slight. And then again, just talking about like the sibling rivalries and stuff like that, I think is really interesting. So he was so fixated on that again, that contributed in some way to him ultimately losing the battle at the end of the book, because again, just showing like the shift in his perspective, what he cared about versus what he should have cared about. I think the chapters featuring Theon Greyjoy were great. He is a character that I really don't like, in the sense that like I don't like the choices his character makes, but I think he's a fantastically well written character. You can tell that like because he's like young, he's brash, he clearly like he wants revenge against the Starks, so that's like what dominates his decision to go and try and take Winterfell at the end of the book. But then it becomes his undoing. When he needed to be way more patient and methodical with how he did things, he kind of just like went ahead on his own and did stuff that he shouldn't have, and it ends up being his undoing. I thought that was great, and I thought it fit a character like that who ended up being a ward of the Starks. Of course, he would have some enmity against them, and I liked how that played out, even though I don't like love the character and the choices he makes and stuff like that along the way. But I thought the arc of his character was great in this book, and I'm excited to see where that goes forward, because he ends in, a terrible spot in this book. I'm trying to think of what else. I guess I'm like not, when I'm reading books, I don't love like the war sections. They're well written and it's interesting, and it is a lot of payoff for setup that's been built. But I kind of tune out when I'm reading just like combat sequences of just like featuring a lot of characters that are just like nameless because they have to be, characters that fight and then die because that's what happens in war. I just don't think that's as interesting as some of the other stuff that he does throughout the bulk of the book. So the end sections, again, I thought were cool to finally see, like, finally Stannis is trying to take on King's Landing. We see like a lot of the plotting that Tyrion Lannister and Cersei Lannister have been putting, like they finally go head to head against each other. So that was cool. But the actual like fighting back and forth wasn't my favorite section, but there were some moments that I thought were pretty cool and descriptions of the battle. I just, again, I'm surprised that there was as little of that as there actually was in the book. And I've seen that as a critique, that it's like way too slow for that reason, but I think it worked extremely well. Maybe that's just like what I'm personally more interested in. I mentioned Catelyn Stark. I liked the chapters focusing on her. I think that she just has such like, even if not like the most interesting plot points are happening, she just has really, I think Martin uses really smart dialogue for her to describe like things that are happening and the way that she thinks and feels about things. Like, she's just a very smart character, and I really like that. I don't love or I guess I should say like the arc for Arya Stark. I mean, that's the one that maybe feels the most like a journey out of all of them, because if you think about like where she ended up at the sack of King's Landing at the end of Game of Thrones, and then like where she starts in this book and where she ends up, it's kind of like night and day. So there were parts of it where I really liked it early on when they're on the road and they're trying to survive, and she was going to, be sent to the Night's Watch, and she has to pretend to be someone she's not. But then once they got to Harrenhal, the castle, I wasn't as interested in everything that happened there, because I felt like a lot of it was kind of like repetitive and routine. But I do feel like we spent a lot of time from Arya's perspective in this book. So it's like I liked the overall arc, but I didn't love like some of the chapters focused on like that particular area, if that makes sense. Sansa Stark, she like, it's interesting where she's kind of the opposite, where her character ends up like in the same place. She's basically just a captive of Joffrey. So, and I think there was some interesting, like what's going to happen with her from like a royal wedding perspective with like the aligning of houses and stuff. And, that's an interesting thing that happens at the end where now the Tyrells are aligned with the Lannisters and help them in battle because Joffrey changed his mind about who he was going to marry. So that I think was cool, but again, not like the most interesting from a plot perspective with things that happen to her, but she does, like, there's a lot that happens around her. So that I thought was pretty effective. And I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, I think this book is so impressive. I'm excited to read the third one. I've never read the third one at all before. There was a section between Brienne of Tarth, who was on Renly's, I think it's Rainbow Guard is what it's called. Then after Renly gets killed, she kind of goes and ends up with Catelyn Stark. This exchange was between the two of them. I was taught that good men must fight evil in this world, and Renly's death was evil beyond all doubt. Yet I was also taught that the gods make kings, not the swords of men. If Stannis is our rightful king, he's not. Robert was never the rightful king either, even Renly said as much. Jaime Lannister murdered the rightful king after Robert killed his lawful heir on the Trident. Where were the gods then? The gods don't care about men, no more than kings care about peasants. I feel like that section, again, just I love like a lot of the stuff that Catelyn Stark thinks and says, but Martin shines in his dialogue between characters, and that's an example where I feel like he just can encapsulate some of the themes about violence and revenge and hatred and stuff like that. And sometimes the folly of, the motivations for conflict and stuff like that. He can just wrap it up in such like succinct prose like that. So I really like that section and really that entire conversation between the two of them. Yeah, I mean, this is an amazing book. I can't say that I guess I end up rooting for the Starks more so than other characters, but I don't think maybe that's the intent, other than just like most chapters happen to focus on them. If you add in like Arya and Sansa and Bran, and if you count Jon Snow. So I was shocked at the end when Winterfell gets overtaken and is burned. Really wasn't expecting that. I thought it was a very cool and somber place for the book to end. I thought Maester Luwin dying was very sad. So, like I like Tyrion Lannister as a character. I don't love the Lannisters as like a royal house, but they're definitely still firmly in power. Joffrey remains on the Iron Throne at the end of this book. So it definitely leaves like in an interesting spot where it feels like at least there's resolution to this kind of part of the war, knowing that there's still going to be more, because we focus so much on Theon Greyjoy's perspective, but like the rest of the Greyjoys made a lot of gains in terms of like land and stuff like that we don't see a ton. So I'm sure that would come back. Stannis Baratheon, we know they get defeated in the Battle of Blackwater, but we don't see what happens after the fact, but you know that he's presumably still out there. And then, of course, Robb Stark as well is still fighting. So you know there's more to come, and I'm excited to read that. But I thought that this was like, again, for a slow burn, kind of slow build book, it definitely pays itself off in the end. So I had such a fun time reading it. The world that he built is just like, it's so easy to immerse yourself in and get lost in. And that's kind of just the best of what fiction writing can be. So I love this book. I would give this book 5 stars. I do think it's masterful. It's not perfect, but it's absolutely masterful in what he set out to do. But I'm still really not sure which one I liked more between Game of Thrones and this. So I'm going to have to keep thinking on that. But I'm definitely going to read the 3rd book at some point, probably in 2026, and we'll give my thoughts then. But yeah, thanks for tuning in.